Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, I want to share with you a story about new beginnings. It is a story about how the things we think we are looking for peace, quiet, a place to hide from the world are rarely the things we actually find. Sometimes, life doesn't give us what we want, it gives us what we need, usually wrapped in a package we never expected. Our story begins in the Verde Valley. Now, if you have never been there, you must understand something about this land. To the untrained eye, it is simply harsh. The sun is a heavy, golden hammer that strikes the earth from dawn until dusk. The wind does not whisper. It hisses through the sagebrush like a warning. But to those who look closer, it is a place of deceptive beauty. It is a land where the cactus flowers bloom in brilliant shades of fuchsia and yellow, delicate and soft, distracting you just long enough for their spines to catch your skin. The valley does not welcome strangers with open arms. It tests them. And on a particularly bright Tuesday in late April, the valley decided to test Miss Cassidy Miller. Cassidy was 26 years old, and she did not belong here. You could tell this immediately by two things: her hat, which was adorned with a silk ribbon far too expensive for the dust of the territory, and her mode of transport. She did not ride a quarter horse or drive a sturdy covered wagon. No. Cassidy arrived in the Verde Valley driving a rickety, open-air buckboard that looked as though it might collapse if the wind blew too hard. And the cargo. It wasn't mining tools or cattle feed. The wagon was piled high, precariously high, with crates of glass apothecary jars, bundles of dried lavender that trailed a scent of Boston spring through the desert heat, and a very large, very stubborn goat named Barnaby. Cassidy was an herbalist. Back east, she had spent her days mixing teas for ladies with nervous constitutions and salves for gardeners with thorn pricks. But Boston had felt small, stifling. Cassidy wanted a life that felt like an adventure. So, with the optimism that only the truly unprepared possess, she had purchased a homestead in the Arizona Territory, sight unseen. The deed said it was a quaint, riverside cottage, perfect for the weary soul. She was currently looking for that cottage, and she was currently very, very lost. The map she held in one gloved hand was fluttering uselessly in the breeze. Barnaby, tethered to the seat beside her, let out a bleat that sounded suspiciously like a complaint. "Oh, hush now, Barnaby," Cassidy chirped, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It's an adventure. We're pioneers. Pioneers don't complain about the heat." Barnaby chewed on the edge of the seat cushion in response. Cassidy squinted against the glare. Ahead, the trail dipped sharply toward the river, the Verde River, a ribbon of cool green cutting through the red earth. And there, down by the water, was a person, finally, a local, someone who could tell her where plot number 42 was located. She urged the tired mule forward. As the wagon creaked toward the riverbank, she saw him clearly. He was a man kneeling by the water, working on something leather, a saddle. Perhaps he was shirtless against the heat, his skin bronzed deep by the sun, his dark hair pulled back severely. He moved with a kind of slow, deliberate quiet that made Cassidy feel instantly loud. He was Apache. Even from here, she could see the strength in his shoulders, the stillness of a hunter. He didn't look up as her noisy, rattling wagon approached. He didn't flinch at the squeak of the wheels. Cassidy pulled on the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt at the top of the short, steep embankment overlooking the river. She needed to make a good impression. She straightened her spine, smoothed her dusty skirts, and prepared to call out a polite greeting. "Excuse me, sir," she began, standing up in the buckboard to be seen. It was a mistake. At that precise moment, Barnaby the goat decided he had grown tired of the seat cushion. He spotted the long, fluttering blue silk ribbon of Cassidy's hat. With a hunger born of boredom, the goat lunged. He grabbed the ribbon. Cassidy felt the tug on her head and swatted at him instinctively. "Barnaby." "No." She stepped back, but the wagon floor was uneven. Her boot heel caught on a crate of peppermint oil. Cassidy's arms pinwheeled. For a second, she hung suspended in the air, a look of pure surprise on her face. And then, gravity took over. She didn't fall gracefully. It wasn't like the novels where the heroine swoons. Cassidy tumbled. She went over the side of the wagon, hit the sandy slope, and rolled. She gathered speed. A chaotic ball of petticoats, dust, and dignity. Tumbling straight down the embankment, she landed with a wet, heavy thwack right at the water's edge. Face down in the red river mud, silence descended on the valley. The only sound was the wind, the gentle rush of the river, and Barnaby chewing contentedly on the blue silk ribbon from the top of the embankment. Cassidy lay there for a moment, stunned. The mud was cool, which was the only nice thing about the situation. She pushed herself up slowly, her hands sinking into the muck. She wiped her eyes, blinking through the grit, and looked up. The man was standing over her. He hadn't moved to catch her. He hadn't gasped. He was just standing there, holding a dripping piece of leather, looking down at her with eyes that were dark, unreadable, and utterly unimpressed. Cassidy spat a little bit of river water out of her mouth. She waited for him to ask if she was hurt. She waited for him to offer a hand. Instead, the man glanced up at the goat on the ridge, then back down at the woman covered in slime at his feet. "You're blocking the water," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, flat and dry as the desert floor. Cassidy blinked. She looked at her knees, which were indeed creating a small dam in the shallows. She scrambled back, slipping on the wet rocks, until she was on dry sand. She stood up, brushing frantically at her dress, which was now a ruin of brown stains. I am so sorry," she stammered, her face burning hotter than the sun. "My goat, the ribbon, I lost my footing." The man went back to rinsing his leather. As if raining women were a common weather occurrence, he simply chose to ignore. "Goats are smarter than people out here," he muttered. "They know not to stand up in a moving wagon." Cassidy bristled. The embarrassment was quickly being replaced by a spark of indignation. "Well, thank you for your concern. I'm fine. By the way, Cassidy Miller. A pleasure to meet you." He didn't offer his name. He just pointed a wet finger toward the east. "Town is that way. The train station is that way. Boston is far that way. I'm not going back to Boston," she said, lifting her chin, though a clump of mud slid down her cheek as she did so. "I live here. I bought the property just next to this river. The homestead." The man paused. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't a smile. It was something closer to disbelief. He stood up fully, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at her with a heavy, tired stare. "The homestead," he repeated. He turned and pointed to a structure about 100 yards down the riverbank, half hidden by mesquite trees. Cassidy turned to look. Her heart gave a painful little squeeze. It wasn't a cottage. It wasn't quaint. It was a shack, and that was being generous. The wood was gray and warped. The front door was hanging off one hinge. And, most notably, it had absolutely no roof. Just open beams staring up at the relentless blue sky. That, she whispered. That, the man confirmed. Last owner left when the snakes moved in. Snakes like the shade. Cassidy swallowed hard. She looked at the ruin of a house. She looked at her wagon full of glass jars and dreams. She looked at the silent, imposing Apache man who clearly thought she was the biggest fool to ever cross the Mississippi. She could turn around. She could get back on the train. She could go back to the gray skies of Boston and the polite tea parties. She looked at Eric, though she didn't know his name yet. She saw the challenge in his eyes. He expected her to run. Everyone expected her to run. Cassidy took a deep breath. It smelled of sage and river mud. "Well," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "It has good ventilation. And I've always wanted a skylight." She marched, or rather, squelched back up the hill toward her wagon, shouting for Barnaby to stop eating the upholstery. Down by the water, Eric watched her go. He watched this strange, mud-covered woman wrestle her goat and steer her wagon toward a house that wasn't a house. He shook his head, a low sound rumbling in his chest. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. "She won't last a week," he said to the river. But the river, which had seen many things come and go in the valley, said nothing at all. The river knew that sometimes the seeds that land in the muddiest places are the ones that grow the deepest roots. And so, Cassidy Miller had arrived, and the quiet life Eric had built for himself was about to get very, very loud. The first 2 weeks in the Verde Valley were not so much a fresh start for Cassidy Miller as they were a siege. The enemy was not the Apache, nor the outlaws, nor even the rattlesnakes that liked to sun themselves on her porch steps. The enemy was the house itself. It creaked, it leaked, and it seemed to resent her presence entirely. Every time she hammered a nail, the wood split. Every time she tried to plant her lavender seedlings, the hard-packed red clay bent her trowel. And watching it all from across the river, like a silent, judgmental hawk, was Eric. He didn't come over. He didn't offer advice. He simply sat at his workbench, braiding leather, occasionally looking up when Cassidy dropped a plank or tripped over her own skirts. To Cassidy, he was a monument of indifference. She had nicknamed him the Sphinx of the Sagebrush in her journal. But she soon learned that Eric was not entirely alone in his fortress. He had a shadow, a small, 10-year-old shadow named Takoda. Takoda was Eric's nephew, a boy with eyes like dark obsidian and knees that were permanently covered in scabs. If Eric was the immovable stone, Takoda was the water that rushed around it, constant, energetic, and impossible to contain. While Eric kept his distance, Takoda was fascinated by the strange woman with the glass jars. He would hide in the mesquite bushes, watching Cassidy work. To a boy raised on practicalities, hunting, riding, mending Cassidy was something entirely new. She was alchemy. She boiled purple flowers in water until the steam smelled like sleep. She talked to her goat as if he were a distinguished gentleman. One Tuesday afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of the boy. And as is often the way with 10-year-old boys, it involved a minor disaster. Cassidy was in her kitchen, which was really just a table under the open sky grinding dried willow bark, when she heard a sharp cry from the riverbank. It wasn't a scream of terror, but the surprised yelp of pain. She didn't hesitate. She dropped her pestle and ran. Skirts flying, She found Takoda near the property line. He had tried to shortcut through an old section of barbed wire fence, and the rusted metal had snagged him. A nasty, jagged tear ran across the back of his hand, welling bright red blood. The boy was holding his wrist, his face pale, trying desperately not to cry. He looked at Cassidy with wide, fearful eyes, perhaps expecting the witch of the herbs to be angry. "All right," Cassidy said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Let's see it." She didn't faint. She didn't shriek. She knelt in the dirt, took his small hand in hers, and examined the cut. "That's a warrior's mark if I ever saw one," she said softly. "But we need to clean it before the dirt gets ideas." She led him not to Eric's cabin, but to hers. She sat him on a crate and went to work. Now, usually, a cut like this in the territory meant stinging whiskey in a dirty rag. Takoda braced himself for the burn, but Cassidy didn't reach for alcohol. She reached for a jar of golden honey and a bowl of warm water steeped with lavender. "This is going to feel sticky," she told him, "but it won't sting. Honey draws out the bad spirits in the wound." She worked with a gentle precision that belied her clumsy arrival in the valley. Her hands, usually fluttering with energy, became still and sure. As she wrapped the bandage, she began to hum. It wasn't a church hymn or a saloon song. It was a lullaby, low and rhythmic, something her mother had sung to her during the thunderstorms in Boston. Lavender's blue, dilly, dilly, lavender's green. Takoda's shoulders dropped. The panic drained out of him, replaced by the sweet scent of flowers and the warmth of her voice. Cassidy was so focused she didn't hear the boots on the gravel. She tied off the bandage and looked up to smile at the boy. There, good as new. That was when she saw him. Eric was standing in the doorway. He filled the frame, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun. His chest was heaving slightly, as if he had run all the way from his forge. His eyes darted from Takoda's bandaged hand to the jars on the table, and finally, to Cassidy. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Cassidy braced herself. She expected him to be angry that she touched the boy, or to mock her potions, but Eric didn't scowl. He looked at the clean white bandage, neatly tied. He smelled the air, not the metallic tang of blood, but the soothing calm of lavender. He looked at Takoda, who wasn't crying, but was actually smiling, holding a piece of honeycomb Cassidy had given him. The harsh lines around Eric's mouth softened. Just a fraction, a hairline crack in the stone. "He shouldn't have been climbing the wire," Eric said. His voice was rough, but the bite was gone. "He's a boy," Cassidy replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Wire is just a challenge to them. Keep the bandage dry. I'll check it tomorrow." Eric nodded once. He reached out, resting his hand briefly on Takoda's head, a gesture of affection, so subtle you would miss it if you blinked. "Come," he said to the boy. As they walked away, Cassidy watched them go. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, the siege was lifting. The thaw continued, slow but steady. 3 days later, the real test came. The rainy season was threatening to break, and Cassidy's roof was still a disaster of mismatched planks and hope. She had spent the entire morning on a ladder, trying to hammer shingles into place, but she was achieving nothing except a bruised thumb and a very colorful vocabulary. She dropped her hammer for the 3rd time. It slid off the roof and landed in the mud with a defeated thud. Cassidy put her head in her hands. "I am going to drown," she told the goat. I am going to drown in my own kitchen. Barnaby. She climbed down to retrieve the hammer. But when she turned around, she nearly walked into a wall of solid chest. Eric was there. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the roof. He held a toolbox in one hand and a bundle of seasoned cedar shingles in the other. "You're using the wrong nails," he said simply. "I'm using the nails the general store sold me," Cassidy argued, crossing her arms to hide her trembling hands. "They sold you tack nails. Those will pull out in the first wind." He walked past her, set the ladder firmly against the wall, and climbed up. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for help. He just worked. For the next hour, Cassidy sat on a stump and watched. It was like watching an artist. Eric didn't waste movement. Every swing of the hammer was efficient, driving the nail home in one blow. He stripped the bad wood, laid the cedar, and sealed the joints with a mixture of tar and pine sap. He moved with a rhythm, a silent competence that was hypnotic. He fixed in 60 minutes what Cassidy had failed to fix in 60 hours. When he climbed down, the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the valley. The roof was solid, tight. He wiped his hands on his trousers and picked up his toolbox to leave. "Wait," Cassidy scrambled up. She ran into her makeshift pantry and came out holding a glass jar. The amber liquid inside glowed in the twilight. "I can't pay you," she said, slightly out of breath. "Not with money. Anyway, but this is spiced peach preserve. My grandmother's recipe. Well, it's very good." She held it out. Eric looked at the jar. Then he looked at her. His face was still stoic. That unreadable mask he wore like armor. "I don't need charity, Mr. Stoneface," Cassidy blurted out, using the nickname she'd only written in her diary. She gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Eric stopped. He looked at her, and for the first time, the corner of his lip twitched upward. It wasn't a smile. Not yet. But it was close. He reached out and took the jar. His fingers brushed hers warm. "Rough. Calloused. And I don't need a neighbor dying of exposure," he drawled. "It's bad for property values." Cassidy blinked, and then she laughed. A bright, genuine sound that seemed to startle the crickets. "Property values. In the middle of nowhere. Nowhere has standards," he replied dryly. He tucked the jar under his arm and walked into the dusk. That night, the rain came, but Cassidy stayed dry. The next morning, the air was scrubbed clean, smelling of wet sage and ozone. Cassidy woke early, brewing a strong pot of coffee over her small stove. She saw movement by the river and poured a second mug. She walked down to the bank where Eric was checking the water levels. She didn't say anything. She just held out the steaming tin cup. Eric took it. He nodded his thanks. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the river rush past. The silence stretched between them. But for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt companionable. "You are quiet," Cassidy said softly, looking out at the water. "I envy that. My mind, it's always loud, always running." Eric took a sip of the coffee. It was black and bitter, just the way he liked it. "The world is loud enough," he said. "I don't see the need to add to it." Cassidy turned to look at his profile. "I talk to fill the space," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If I stop talking, I have to hear the things I'm trying to forget. The emptiness." It was a vulnerable admission, a dangerous one. In the West, you didn't show your belly to a predator. But Eric didn't bite. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw the fatigue behind her smile. He saw the fear she tried to hide with ribbons and chatter. The space isn't empty. Cassidy, he said. He used her name for the first time. It sounded strange and weighty on his tongue. It's just waiting. He looked back at the river. I like the silence because it's the only place the past doesn't follow me. When I speak, I remember who I used to speak to, who isn't here anymore. He didn't explain. He didn't mention names or tragedies. But in that moment, the distance between them collapsed. Cassidy realized that his silence wasn't arrogance, it was a shield. And Eric realized that her chatter wasn't foolishness. It was a survival mechanism. They were two wounded things, circling each other in the high desert, both trying to survive the ghosts they had brought with them. Cassidy took a sip of her coffee to hide the sudden emotion in her throat. "Well," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The roof held. I told you it would." Eric said, "The peach preserves," she asked. "Did they survive the night?" Eric glanced at her. And this time, the smile was real. Small, fleeting, but real. "Takoda ate half the jar. He says you are a witch, a good witch. I hope. He hasn't decided yet," Eric said, turning back toward his cabin. "But he asked, when you're baking bread?" He walked away, leaving Cassidy standing by the river. The sun was cresting the red cliffs, painting the valley in gold. The stone face had cracked, and underneath, Cassidy had seen a glimpse of the man hiding inside a man who fixed roofs for strangers, who loved his nephew, and who, despite his best efforts, was beginning to care about the woman with the goat. For the first time since leaving Boston, Cassidy didn't feel lost. She felt adjacent to found, and for now, that was enough. Peace, in the West, is often just a pause between storms. And, for Cassidy and Eric, the peace they had found that fragile, tentative truce built on roof repairs and peach preserves was about to be shattered by a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. It had to do with water. And it had to do with greed. The Verde River was the lifeblood of the valley. In a land of red dust and relentless sun, water was power. And no one craved power more than Silas Thorne. Thorne was a cattle baron of the old breed, a man who believed that if he could see it, he should own it. He owned the grazing land to the north, the shipping yards to the east, and he had his eyes fixed firmly on the stretch of river that bordered Eric's land. For years, Thorne had pressured Eric to sell, and for years, Eric had refused. Eric's land was not just soil, it was ancestry. It was the place his sister had died. It was the only home Takoda knew. But now, there was a new problem. A complication in skirts named Cassidy Miller. Thorne's cattle needed access to the lower creek to graze. And Cassidy's quaint homestead that small, defiant patch of land she had bought from a swindler in Boston sat right across the access trail. She was the cork in the bottle. Thorne didn't like corks. He preferred to smash the bottle. It started slowly, a shadow game. First, it was the fences. Eric would wake to find his wire cutter's work undone. The carefully strung barbed wire snapped clean, leaving the mustangs he was training vulnerable to the open range. The tension in the valley pulled tight as a bowstring. Eric stopped sleeping. He spent his nights patrolling the perimeter, a rifle in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the darkness for movement. He became the stone face again, hard, unreachable, consumed by the need to protect. Cassidy saw the toll it was taking. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he poured his morning coffee. One evening, after a particularly brutal day where 3 sections of fence had been destroyed, the Mustangs were frantic. The scent of unknown men and the snap of wire had spooked them. They were pacing the corral, coats slick with sweat, eyes rolling white with terror. They were ready to bolt. And if they bolted, they would be lost to the canyons. Eric was in the corral, trying to calm a roan mare, but his own anxiety was bleeding into the animal. The horse reared, hooves striking the air inches from Eric's head. "Easy," Eric shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Easy, girl." But the mare wouldn't settle. Cassidy watched from the fence line. She didn't know how to rope a steer. She didn't know how to mend a fence. But she knew nervous systems. She ran back to her cabin, her mind racing through her mental catalog of herbs. Valerian root for the nerves, chamomile for the spirit, passion flower for the terror. She brewed a concentrated tea, a dark, earthy slurry that smelled of damp earth and sleep. She carried the bucket to the corral, climbing through the rails without a shred of the fear she should have felt. "What are you doing?" Eric snapped, backing away from the rearing mare. "Get out." "She's dangerous." "She's not dangerous. She's terrified," Cassidy countered, her voice calm, cutting through the dust. "And so are you." She poured the mixture into the water trough. "It's a sleeping draft. Mild, just enough to take the edge off the panic. It works on widows in Boston. It will work on wild horses in Arizona." Eric looked at her. He looked at the frantic horses. He had spent his life believing that force and patience were the only tools a man had. But he was out of patience. And force wasn't working. He looked into Cassidy's eyes. They were steady, certain. "Let them drink," he said softly. They stood together in the twilight as the horses, driven by thirst, dipped their muzzles into the trough. 10 minutes later, the pacing stopped. The roan mare lowered her head, blowing a soft breath through her nostrils. The corral grew quiet. Eric leaned against the fence post, his body sagging with relief. He looked at Cassidy, and for a moment, the barrier between them dissolved entirely. "You have magic in those jars." "Cassidy Miller," he whispered. "No magic." She smiled, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Just nature, and a little stubbornness." It was the closest they had ever been. A moment of shared victory against the encroaching dark. But the dark does not like to lose. 2 nights later, the wind changed. It was what the locals called the devil's wind, a hot, dry gale that roared down from the mountains, stripping the moisture from the air and carrying the scent of ozone and dust. It was a wind that set teeth on edge and made the skin prickle with static. The moon was hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. The valley was pitch black, save for the swaying silhouettes of the mesquite trees. Cassidy was inside her cabin, labeling a new batch of dried sage. The wind rattled her new roof, the roof Eric had built, but it held firm. She felt safe. She didn't hear the horses approach. The wind was too loud, masking the sound of hoofbeats and the hushed voices of men who did not want to be seen. Silas Thorne's men didn't intend to kill her. They were cruel, but they weren't murderers, at least. Not in their own minds. They just wanted to scare the city woman. They wanted to smoke her out, send her running back to the train station with her tail between her legs so the land would be open for the taking. A match was struck. A simple, small flicker of sulfur against the darkness. It was dropped into a pile of tumbleweeds that had blown up against the back of Cassidy's cabin. The devil's wind caught that spark and turned it into a weapon. It didn't start as a fire. It started as an explosion of heat. The dry brush, cured by months of drought, went up with a whoosh that sounded like a heavy exhale. Inside, Cassidy smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke, but not the cozy scent of a stove. This was acrid. Fast, she turned toward the back window and screamed. The glass was glowing orange. Tongues of flame were already licking up the siding. Fed by the gale-force wind, panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. "Barnaby," she cried out. She grabbed her shawl and ran for the door, but then she stopped. Her eyes darted to the heavy cedar chest at the foot of her bed. It contained her grandmother's journals, her formulas, the botanical illustrations she had spent 5 years creating. It was her life's work. Her legacy. It was a foolish choice. A split-second calculation made in terror. She ran back, grabbed the heavy chest, and began to drag it toward the door. The smoke was already curling under the ceiling, thick and gray. Outside, across the river, the glow woke Takoda. The boy had been sleeping on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and saw the orange monster eating the sky above Cassidy's land. "Cassidy," he yelled. He looked for his uncle, but Eric was patrolling the north ridge. A half-mile away, Takoda didn't think. He didn't consider his size, or the heat, or the danger. He only thought of the woman who sang lullabies and put honey on his cuts. And he thought of the goat. He knew Barnaby slept in the small lean-to shed attached to the side of the cabin, the side where the wind was pushing the flames. Takoda ran. He splashed through the shallow river crossing, his small boots slipping on the rocks, scrambling up the bank toward the inferno. By the time he reached the cabin, the heat was physical, a wall that pushed him back. "Cassidy," he screamed. But the wind tore the name from his mouth. He heard a bleating sound, high-pitched and terrified. Barnaby was trapped in the shed. Takoda grabbed the latch of the shed door. It was hot to the touch. He yanked it open. Up on the north ridge, Eric saw the light. It wasn't the sunrise. It was the wrong color. It was the color of blood and destruction. "No," he breathed. The word was a prayer and a curse. He spurred his horse, riding blindly down the treacherous trail. He didn't care if the horse stumbled. He didn't care about his own neck. He rode with the desperation of a man who was watching his worst nightmare replay itself. Fire, loss, helplessness. He hit the flat land and galloped toward the river. He saw Cassidy first. She was in the front yard, dropped to her knees, coughing violently. She had dragged the heavy chest clear of the porch and was staring at the house, her face streaked with soot and tears. Eric vaulted off his horse before it had even stopped moving. He grabbed Cassidy by the shoulders, shaking her. "Are you hurt?" he roared over the sound of the fire. Cassidy looked up at him, dazed. "My books. I got the books," she coughed. "The wind, it just—" Eric scanned the yard. "Where is Takoda?" Cassidy froze. Her eyes went wide, the white stark against the soot on her face. He was with you. He's at your cabin. He was on the porch," Eric said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He saw the fire. Then they heard it. Not the bleat of a goat, but a scream, a child's scream. It came from the side of the house, from the shed that was now fully engulfed, the roof sagging under the weight of the flames. Takoda. Eric didn't run. He flew. He rounded the corner of the house. The shed was a furnace. The door was open, swinging wildly in the wind. But the entrance was blocked by falling debris. Takoda, uncle, the voice was small, choked with smoke, coming from deep inside the burning structure. Eric didn't hesitate. He didn't check for stability. He wrapped his coat around his head and dove through the wall of fire. Inside, it was hell. The heat was so intense, it sucked the air right out of his lungs. His eyes stung, blinding him. Takoda, keep talking. Talk to me. I can't move. Eric crawled on his hands and knees, feeling the floorboards searing his skin. He found the boy in the corner. Takoda was curled into a ball, shielding his face. A heavy crossbeam from the roof had splintered and fallen, pinning the boy's left leg to the ground. Barnaby the goat had already bolted, long gone into the night. But the boy had stayed. Eric grabbed the beam. The wood was burning. He hissed as the heat bit into his palms. But he didn't let go. With a roar that came from the very bottom of his soul, he heaved upward. The beam shifted. Pull your leg, Takoda. Pull it, the boy whimpered, barely conscious. But he dragged himself backward. Eric dropped the burning timber. He scooped the boy into his arms, shielding Takoda's small body with his own. He turned to the door, but the roof groaned. A shower of sparks and burning shingles rained down on them. Hold your breath, Eric commanded. He charged back through the flames, his coat smoking, his boots crunching on embers. They burst out into the cool night air. Tumbling onto the dirt, Eric rolled, smothering the sparks on his coat, keeping Takoda tight against his chest. He dragged them another 20 feet, away from the collapsing structure, before he collapsed onto his back, gasping for air that tasted like ash. Eric, oh my God. Eric Cassidy was there. She fell to her knees beside them. Eric sat up, coughing, his hands trembling violently. The boy, he rasped. Check the boy. Takoda was lying on the grass. He was terrifyingly still. His face was gray, soot masking his features. Cassidy's hands hovered over him. She checked his breath. It was shallow, rattling in his chest. Smoke inhalation. Then she looked down at his leg. It was twisted at a sickening angle just below the knee. The pant leg was torn, and the skin was bruised dark purple. He's breathing, Cassidy stammered, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. But his leg, Eric. His leg is broken. Badly. Eric stared at the boy. He stared at the twisted limb. And then he looked at the inferno that used to be Cassidy's home. The adrenaline that had allowed him to lift the beam was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow pit in his stomach. The only sound in the world was the roar of the fire consuming the last of the timber, and the wheezing, fragile breath of the child he had sworn to protect. He looked at Cassidy, and in the light of the flames, his eyes were no longer the eyes of the man who had shared coffee with her by the river. They were the eyes of a man who had seen his worst fear come true, and he was looking for someone to blame. Grief is a shapeshifter. In the first moments, it is sharp, breathless panic. But when the danger passes, when the adrenaline drains away and leaves you shivering in the dirt, grief changes. It hardens. It looks for a target. It looks for a reason. For Eric, kneeling in the ash with his nephew's broken body cradled in his arms, grief became a shield. And the only way to hold that shield up was to push everything else away. The fire was out, extinguished by the sudden, merciful arrival of rain that sizzled on the black embers. But the damage was done. The shed was a skeleton of charred wood. The air smelled of wet soot and ruin. Cassidy was still on her knees, her hands black with ash, trembling as she reached toward the boy. Eric, she whispered. We need to set the leg. I have splints in the wagon. I have willow bark for the pain. Eric flinched at her voice. He pulled Takoda tighter against his chest, turning his back to her. When he looked up, his eyes were strangers. The warmth she had seen by the river, the humor over the peach preserves, it was all gone. In its place was the cold, flat stare of a man who had survived too much loss and had decided he would not survive another. Don't, he said. The word was a blade. Eric, please, Cassidy pleaded, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. I can help him. Help him. Eric stood up, lifting the unconscious boy effortlessly. Though his own arms shook, he turned on her, and the fury in his voice was terrifying because it was so quiet. You did this. Cassidy recoiled as if he had struck her. No, Eric. I didn't. The men. They came for you. He interrupted, his voice rising, cracking with the strain. They want your land. They want you gone. And because you are stubborn, because you refuse to listen, they burned my home. They broke my boy. It wasn't true. Deep down, in the place where his reason lived, Eric knew it wasn't true. He knew Thorn was the villain. He knew Cassidy was a victim just as much as he was. But reason has no voice when you are holding a child who won't wake up. In that moment, Cassidy was the variable. She was the change. And change had brought tragedy. You brought this poison to the valley. He spat, gesturing to the smoking ruins. We were safe before you came. We were invisible. Now he looked down at Takoda's pale face. If you hadn't come, he would be sleeping in his bed. Cassidy stood there, swaying in the rain. The words hit her square in the chest, sinking deep into the tender, guilty part of her heart. She looked at the boy she loved like a son. She looked at the man she had started to love like a partner, and she believed him. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never meant. Go, Eric said. He didn't shout it. He just breathed it out, final and exhausted. Go back to your city. Cassidy, go back to your tea parties and your paved streets. You don't belong here. You never did. He turned and walked away, carrying the boy into the darkness toward his own cabin, leaving Cassidy alone in the rain. Standing in the wreckage of her dream, the departure was quiet. There was no dramatic storming off, no shouting matches. There was only the sound of a woman moving like a ghost through the remains of her life. Cassidy didn't fix the wagon wheel that squeaked. She didn't bother to clean the mud off the seat. She packed only what she needed to survive the journey to the train station. Her clothes, her grandmother's locket. But she left the rest. She left the jars of dried sage and chamomile lined up on the one shelf that hadn't burned. She left the garden tools leaning against the fence. She left the heavy chest of books in the yard, covered with a tarp. She left them because she felt she had lost the right to them. She felt she had forfeited her place in this land. When she climbed onto the buckboard seat, she looked across the river one last time. Eric's cabin was silent. The curtains were drawn. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. Goodbye, she whispered. She snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. Barnaby, the goat, sensing her sorrow, sat quietly in the back, chewing on a piece of straw. Cassidy didn't look back. She couldn't. She stared straight ahead at the long, dusty road leading east, her heart feeling like a stone she had swallowed, heavy and cold in her stomach. 2 days passed. The valley felt different without her. The silence, which Eric had once prized, now felt oppressive. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. It was the silence of a tomb. Eric sat by Takoda's bedside, watching the boy's chest rise and fall. He had set the leg himself, his hands working on autopilot, but he couldn't fix the boy's silence. The smoke had been thick. Takoda had slept for 48 hours. Lost in fever dreams. Eric hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. He sat in the chair, staring at the wall, replaying the fire in his mind. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw Cassidy's face stricken, tear-stained, crumbling under his anger. He told himself he was right. He told himself he had cut out the infection to save the limb. But the house felt cold, and the air smelled stale. On the morning of the third day, the fever broke. Takoda stirred. He groaned, shifting his leg, and his eyes fluttered open. They were glassy and confused, but they focused on Eric. "Uncle," he croaked. Eric exhaled, a sound that was half sob. He leaned forward, gripping the boy's hand. "I'm here, Koda. I'm here. You're safe?" Takoda blinked, looking around the dim room. "The fire, it's out," Eric promised. "It's gone." Takoda licked his dry lips. "And Barnaby the goat." Eric managed a weak, watery smile. "That goat is too stubborn to die. I saw him eating my laundry line this morning." Takoda smiled, but then his brow furrowed. He tried to sit up, wincing. "Where is she? Where is Cassidy?" Eric went still. He looked down at his hands. "She's gone. Takoda, gone." The boy's voice rose in panic. "Gone to town." "No," Eric said softly. "Gone home. Back east. She realized this place wasn't safe for her." Takoda stared at him. "You sent her away." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "I had to," Eric said, his voice hardening defensively. "She almost got you killed. Takoda. If she hadn't been there." "No," Takoda shouted, forcing himself up despite the pain. "No, that's not true. Takoda, lie down." "She didn't run," the boy cried, tears filling his eyes. "Uncle, you weren't there. When the fire started, I ran to the shed. I got trapped." The door jammed. He grabbed Eric's shirt, pulling him closer, desperate to be understood. "She was outside. Uncle. She was screaming your name. And then she tried to come in." Eric froze. "What?" "She tried to open the door." Takoda sobbed. "But it was hot. And I was scared the fire would get her too. So I locked it from the inside. I locked her out." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eric stared at the boy. "She was banging on the wood," Takoda whispered, exhausted. "She was hitting it with a rock, trying to break the lock. She didn't run away. Uncle. She stayed. She stayed until you came." Eric pulled away, stumbling back as if he had been punched. The memory rushed back. Cassidy in the yard, dragging the chest, coughing. She hadn't been saving her books. She had been looking for a tool. She had been trying to break down a door that a terrified child had locked. "She didn't leave me," Takoda whispered, closing his eyes. "Why did you make her leave?" Eric couldn't answer. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him, suffocating and absolute. He turned and walked out of the cabin. He needed air. He stepped onto the porch and looked across the river. The morning sun was bright, cruel in its clarity. He looked at Cassidy's homestead. It was a ruin, the charred remains of the shed, the smoke-stained siding. But what caught his eye was the garden. Cassidy had spent weeks coaxing life out of the red dirt. She had planted rows of lavender, sage, and wild mint. She had hauled water from the river, bucket by bucket, singing to the green shoots. Now, after 2 days of neglect, under the brutal Arizona sun, the garden was dying. The lavender was gray and brittle. The mint was wilted, lying flat against the cracked earth. Eric walked down to the riverbank, his boots sinking into the mud, the same mud where she had fallen that first day. He looked at the dying plants, and he realized, with a clarity that hurt worse than the fire, that he was looking at himself. He had spent years building fences. He had spent years pushing people away, telling himself he was strong, that he was a survivor. But he wasn't surviving. He was just enduring. He was withering. Just like those unwatered plants. He had chosen safety. He had chosen loneliness. And in doing so, he had driven away the only rain that had fallen on his life in a decade. "I am a fool," he whispered to the rushing water. But the river didn't offer comfort this time. It just kept moving. Indifferent to his regret, Eric turned back to the cabin. He looked at his saddlebags hanging by the door. He looked at the rifle leaning against the wall. He didn't know if he could fix this. He didn't know if a man could burn a bridge and then expect to walk back across it. But for the first time in his life, Eric knew he had to try. He wasn't going to wait for the rain anymore. He was going to go find it. The train station in Prescott was a place of iron and steam, a stark contrast to the red earth and silence of the Verde Valley. Here, the air didn't smell of sagebrush. It smelled of coal smoke and machinery. It was the smell of progress. It was the smell of leaving. Cassidy sat on a wooden bench near the platform edge, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked like a wildflower that had been pulled up by the roots and left to wither on the pavement. Her dress, once vibrant yellow, was dulled by the dust of the road. Her hat, the one Barnaby the goat had chewed on that very first day, sat crookedly on her head. She watched the eastbound train take on water. The locomotive hissed and groaned. A massive beast, preparing to carry her back to a life she no longer wanted. Back to paved streets. Back to polite conversations. Back to loneliness. The conductor checked his pocket watch. "All aboard," he shouted, his voice echoing off the station walls. Cassidy stood up. Her legs felt heavy, as if the gravity of the territory was trying to hold her down. She reached for her small suitcase. But then, the crowd parted. It wasn't the dramatic parting of the Red Sea. It was the uneasy shifting of city folk moving away from something they didn't understand. Eric was walking down the platform. He wasn't riding a horse. He wasn't galloping in a cloud of dust to save the day. He was simply walking. And yet, he looked more out of place here than a wolf in a parlor. He wore his worn buckskins and his flat-brimmed hat, dusty and travel-stained. He moved with that distinct, silent grace that made the bustle of the station seem chaotic and loud. He stopped 10 feet from her. He didn't look at the train. He didn't look at the staring passengers. He looked only at her. The whistle blew a shrill, lonely sound that cut through the noise. "You're late," Cassidy said, her voice trembling, trying to summon a scrap of her old defiance. "The train is leaving. Let it leave," Eric said. He stepped closer. In his hand, he held something. It wasn't a bouquet of flowers. It wasn't a ring. It was a glass jar. Cassidy recognized it immediately. It was the jar of spiced peach preserves she had given him weeks ago, the payment he had accepted for fixing her roof. But it was empty now, and it had been washed. The glass sparkled in the afternoon sun, scrubbed clean of every sticky trace of sugar. treated with a care that spoke louder than words. He held it out to her. "The jar is empty," he said, his voice rough with the dust of the road and the weight of his own heart. "The house is empty, and I am empty." Cassidy stared at the glass. Her breath hitched in her chest. "I was not afraid of the fire, Cassidy," Eric continued, taking another step. "I have fought fire before. I was not afraid of Thorn. I have fought men like him my whole life." He paused, and for the first time, his stoic mask crumbled completely, revealing the terrified man beneath. "I was afraid of losing you. And because I was afraid, I made it happen. I pushed you away because it is easier to mourn someone who leaves than to mourn someone who dies." The conductor shouted again. "Final call." Cassidy looked at the train, then back at Eric. She saw the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. She saw the apology living in his dark eyes. But Cassidy Miller was not the same woman who had rolled down the embankment months ago. The West had forged her into something stronger. She didn't melt into his arms. She stood her ground. "I can handle the wind, Eric," she said, her voice rising over the hiss of the steam engine. "I can handle the fire. I can even handle a grumpy saddlemaker who thinks feelings are optional." She took a breath, lifting her chin. "But I will not handle being your scapegoat. I will not be the thing you blame when the world scares you." Eric nodded slowly. He understood. He respected her enough not to argue. "Then don't be," he said softly. "Be my partner. Teach me how to stop looking for the exit. Teach me how to heal." He extended his hand not to take the jar, but to take hers. "Please, come home." The train gave a final lurch. The wheels began to turn, metal grinding on metal, picking up speed as it chugged out of the station, heading east toward Boston. But Cassidy wasn't on it. She was standing on the platform, her hand wrapped firmly in Eric's. The empty jar pressed between them, a vessel waiting to be filled with something new. They say time moves differently in the Verde Valley. It moves with the seasons, not the clock. In the months that followed, the scar on the land where Cassidy's cabin had stood began to heal. But they didn't just rebuild what was lost. They built something better. The new cabin was a testament to two worlds colliding. It had the sturdy, weatherproof joinery of an Apache master craftsman, solid enough to withstand any gale. But around it, the land softened. Window boxes overflowed with purple verbena and bright orange poppies. A new garden, twice the size of the old one, thrived near the river, fed by an irrigation system Eric had designed. And on the porch, you could often hear laughter. Takoda, his legs still healing but strong, would hobble around on crutches made of polished willow wood, chasing a very old, very stubborn goat who had somehow survived the fire to eat another day. The boy's laugh was no longer the quiet sound of a child walking on eggshells. It was loud, free, and echoed off the canyon walls. Cassidy and Eric didn't become perfect people. They still argued. Cassidy still talked too much when she was nervous, and Eric still retreated into silence when he was thinking. But now, when the storms rolled in over the mountains, they didn't close the shutters and hide in separate rooms. They stood on the porch together and watched the rain fall. As I look back on their story, I am reminded of a lesson the desert teaches us. If we are quiet enough to listen, we often think that strength means standing alone, unshakable as a mountain. We think resilience is about being hard, about needing nothing and no one. But in the Verde Valley, I learned the truth. The strongest things in the desert aren't the rocks that resist the wind eventually. The wind wears them down to dust. The strongest things are the roots that tangle together beneath the soil. They hold on to each other in the dark, sharing water, sharing life, anchoring each other against the storm. Survival isn't about never falling. It's about who reaches out to catch you when you do. And sometimes, the hand that catches you is the one you least expect. Thank you for listening to this story on Eagle Eye Apache. I hope Cassidy and Eric's journey reminded you that it is never too late to rebuild, and never too late to forgive. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of Eric's apology? Do you think you would have gotten on the train? Or would you have stayed? And please, tell me in the comments below. Where are you listening from? Today, I always love to see how far our campfire circle extends around the world. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like. It helps the channel more than you know. Share this video with a friend who might need a reminder that they are not alone. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Until next time, my friends, keep your eyes on the horizon and ride safe.